Doubt is not the enemy of faith. It is the invitation into a deeper faith. Faith isn't the absence of doubt, as some people assume, but rather the means to push through it instead. Let me say it like this. There is no road to spiritual maturity that does not go straight through doubt. There's no road to spiritual maturity that bypasses your doubts. You have to go straight through them. Like, listen to me, if faith is gonna be real for you in your life, if it's gonna be real, like if it's gonna be deep, if it's gonna be robust in your life, you're gonna have to wrestle through it. Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Man, it's so good to be back together this week. We are continuing on in a teaching series, a collection of talks that we have been in over the last month called Encountering Jesus, where we have just been looking at many of the different encounters or interactions people had with Jesus in those days immediately after his death and resurrection. These are the days that would be considered like the aftermath, of all that had happened, in those days after Jesus had risen from the dead. How many of y'all know it wasn't like necessarily calm? Like it wasn't. I mean, people were encountering him, and it was blowing their minds. And this is a period of time that church history has traditionally called Eastertide. It's a 40-day window from his resurrection to his ascension. And we just kind of want to zoom in on some of these encounters to kind of see, how people reacted to encountering and experiencing and interacting with the resurrected Jesus. And one of the encounters that I find to be so, I would say like surprising and confusing even on some level, it takes place in Matthew 28. And Matthew 28 is one of the most famous chapters we have in the entire Bible. There's language in Matthew 28 that has literally changed the world. At the end of Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20, Jesus stands up on that mountain, right? And he gives this commission to his followers, to his disciples, and he tells them to go into all the world to preach the gospel, to make disciples of all nations, and to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they actually go do that. And I mean, that's why Christianity is global to this day, right? And yet, what's interesting to me is that 3 verses prior, in verse 16, this is the encounter that we see these 11 disciples have with Jesus. In verse 16, it says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." And this is like a detail I've missed, like at times, because I'm anticipating verses 19 and 20, and I'm like, all right, let's just get to the good stuff. And this is an important detail I want us to pause and look at today, because Matthew's telling us that 11 of them, the 11 remaining disciples, go up to this mountain that Jesus tells them to go to. They're down one because the previous chapter, Judas has hung himself, and because he's felt so much shame and guilt over betraying Jesus, that he's no longer with them. So the remaining 11 climb this mountain. They go to this spot. They come together. They see Jesus, and he tells us that some of them begin to instantly worship. They're like, "That's my Lord. That's my God. That is Jesus." And they begin to worship. And others look at him and they're like, "I'm not sure that's really him." They've already seen him more than once since his resurrection. So this isn't the first time they've encountered him. This is just another instance. And so we're getting towards the end before Jesus ascends into heaven. And some of his closest followers, some of the 11, okay, are looking at him and they're going, "I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that's really Jesus." Furthermore, I'm not sure that's really God. And I think this is a fascinating encounter that I want us to kind of wrestle with today, because I want us to spend our time this morning really talking about this idea of how to deal with our doubt. How to deal with our doubt. We all face all sorts of doubt on all sorts of levels. Specifically, I want us to look at how to deal with spiritual doubt. And I hope that I can maybe give you some things that will help you in kind of your journey with this. I think we all deal with it. And so I really have a message today that I've worked pretty hard on this week, that I hope will help you answer some things maybe that you've been wrestling with in your own journey with faith and with Jesus and with God and all of that stuff. This past week I had an experience that I would describe to be kind of like a visceral emotion that like began to rise up in me as I was intaking the media. I was looking at all the current events and the news. I was scrolling X. I was reading Fox and CNN and doing all that stuff. And I was getting caught up on like Trump's case. I was getting caught up on like this new tax hike that's supposed to be happening. And I was reading all these other like headlines and kind of newsworthy events. And as I just kind of like zoomed out for a second to kind of look at all of it, I just kind of had this deep internal emotion that began to just rise up along this idea that it just seems like our culture is aching for good leadership. Have you ever felt that? I mean, maybe you've never felt it in those words, but do you just feel that right now? It's just aching for good leadership, groaning for good leadership. We've already lived through an incredibly bizarre political season 4 years ago. We're going to do it all again, like real soon. And what's going to happen is like each candidate is going to come along and they're going to claim to have the ability to fix what is wrong with America. And what's fascinating to me about all of this is how most of us tend to respond to those kinds of claims. Most of us respond to claims like that, regardless of who the candidate is. We're like, doubt it, not going to happen. Like they're just saying what they've got to say to get elected and get into office. And I just think like if we're honest with ourselves, like we look around, we kind of look within. There just seems to be so much emotion around this question, like, can we really trust anyone to lead us? Is there anyone who can really lead us well? The suspicion we feel, I think it comes from a real place, actually. I think we've all seen so much abuse in leadership, like that as a result, many of us have developed this deep sort of cynical suspicion inside of us towards anyone who says like, hey, trust me, or follow me, I'll take you to where you need to go. And we've seen abuses of leadership, externally. We've seen them in culture. We've seen them in politics. We've seen them internally in the church. And as a result, there's just people who are so skeptical, suspicious of these types of claims, like follow me, trust me. We're suspicious about their power dynamics. We're suspicious about their agenda, and maybe rightfully so on some level. And I think given the moment that we are living in right now, I would guess that just about all of us would agree on this idea that doubt is inevitable. Doubt is inevitable. We live inside of a culture of doubt. Sociologically, our culture is the exact definition of socialism. Or I'm sorry, secularism. That was a Freudian. Yeah. How do you bounce back from that? So we all live in this culture, right now, just full of doubt. And sociologically, our culture is the exact definition of secularism, which basically secularism is this idea that like the greater culture that we live in has been designed and structured to eliminate faith. That the greater culture has been designed and structured to at least minimize faith from our public consciousness, to the point that faith is never seriously considered as a potential solution to all of the problems that we face. So what's gone on, secularism is this idea where faith that once existed kind of in the center has been pushed out into the margins or to the fringe, not to be taken very seriously as a viable option or a viable solution to the cultural challenges, the societal challenges that we face, as a people. And so when you think about it, we're all living within a social and cultural construct that does not facilitate any sort of attention span towards the sacred or towards things of faith. There's nothing that's trying to get you to focus on those things or take some of your day or some of your week to focus on the sacred or the spiritual or things of faith. It's a culture that quite honestly doesn't have much interest in the condition of your soul. And I don't know where you're at on all of that. But I would guess that most of us have had times of just dealing with doubt, struggling with it. You ever notice this about doubt, that doubt usually has a way of fulfilling its own expectations? Doubt usually has a way of like arriving at what it assumed. It's why there's an entire term called self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like because you said it, you believed it, and then you lived into it. And doubt just has a way of getting what it expects, and it's a challenge I think we all have to look at, wrestle with, and walk towards and walk through. And so here's, I think, what we need to remember, though, about doubt is that doubt has always existed, but it has not always been so widespread. This is a unique time. It's a unique time. If you go back several hundred years and you take a look, you'll find that there have been times throughout history where it was much more difficult than it is now to be a person who is full of doubt. Because historically speaking, human spirituality was always a dominant part of the mainstream. Every reference point, art, philosophy, culture, government, all of it ran through a faith framework in times past. But this is not our experience today, is it? So things have radically shifted, especially post-Enlightenment, a couple hundred years ago. Like things have really shifted and changed to where faith and spiritual things, the sacred is not at the center of culture. It's not even at the center of our consciousness. It's pushed out into the fringe. And that's where a secular culture wants it to be. That's the spot it wants it to be in. And we don't live in a culture that actively facilitates and platforms things of faith. Wouldn't you agree? And a huge factor for this is what is called postmodernism. Most succinctly, postmodernism is a suspicion of any sort of meta-narrative. So this basically is where anyone comes along and makes a claim about having an understanding of reality that everybody else must have and everybody else must submit to, and like those people, like big claims. Like this is the way the world really works, and this is what spirituality really is, and this is how we all need to think, and so postmodernism is this idea where there is all of this suspicion that we have of claims like that, because we're pretty sure that anybody who talks like that is only doing that because they have an agenda of power that will result in oppression. And so when and this plays out when you look through like the 19th and 20th centuries, and even, we could probably go even back, to really the beginning of humanity on the planet. It seems to be that this is true, that whenever anyone came along and said, here's the true and right way to view the world, or here's the true and right way to view God, or here's the true and right way to view morality and ethics and all of this stuff, that just about like every single time, like after they got done making those kinds of claims, next came, military force, right? And that was ready to take away the rights of people. And so I think because of that, I think obviously living this many years later, I think we obviously have to our credit, and I think it's a good thing that we can look back and take lessons from history. And so whenever those kinds of claims pop up, it's like, I'm not going to necessarily take that verbatim. I'm not necessarily just going to believe what you said. I'm going to doubt it. I'm going to be suspicious. I'm going to be skeptical of those types of things. And so the way this plays out for us today is that anytime someone comes along and says, man, there's one true leader, or they come along and they say, there's only one way to salvation, or they come along and they say, man, the only way you can get into a relationship with God is this way, what happens is people become very suspicious and nervous of these kinds of claims that are being made. Well, this is postmodernism to a T. It's a suspicion of any sort of larger meta-narratives. Well, part of the challenge for us as Christians is that we actually do have a meta-narrative that we live into that is deeply rooted in this belief and in this idea that Jesus is Lord. Like that Jesus is the resurrected Lord of human history. And so what can happen for Christians kind of living in this social dynamic, societal dynamic, is that we can feel our faith in conflict with these larger societal dynamics around meta-truth claims. It's like, what is really going on here? Like that is, and we feel it. We feel the pull. You ever just looked at kind of like the world and what is so commonly accepted in terms of like beliefs and ethics culturally, and then just thought, man, it just felt a bit homeless. Just felt like, I can't let anybody know I believe this stuff. Like, this is crazy. There's no one who would appreciate that. And I think what we got to realize is that when the majority of like the population is full of suspicion and doubt, it's nearly impossible for this to not rub off on us on some level. It's really like next to impossible for that not to influence us on some sort of level. And so that's like culture. That's like a dynamic you can't just avoid. Like it exists. I think it's a lot more difficult now to live in a post-Christian world than it was to live in a Christian world, or even maybe a pre-Christian world. I think it's much more difficult. Like it's like how do you live? You can't take your cues from the past of people in 1950s America. Like Leave It to Beaver with a white picket fence, and everybody went to church together. Like you can't really get your information from that example. It's like, how do we live now in a world that has essentially moved Jesus away from the center and into the fringe, off into the margins? And yet, what I would say is like when we look at all of that culturally, I think that beyond that, when we tend to doubt, when we tend to struggle, when we tend to wrestle with our doubts, I don't think it's always the larger cultural secularism that's to blame. I think oftentimes it just comes down to our own personal circumstances. I think a lot of times it comes down to our own personal doubt that is leading us away from these large claims about Jesus and faith and all of that. It's like I don't know. Like I come to church and I listen to these things and I'm like, is that really like? And I don't want anybody to know. Like, man, they seem to all be on board, and I'm walking out going like, that's a crazy thing to believe. And I think that like a lot of our doubts center around our own personal stuff that exists within us. And here's what I mean by all this. Let me just say this to you. I think that we can sometimes have a very naive faith. And what I mean by that is that it's as if our faith, it's not that our faith is childlike, it's that it's childish. Like it's good to have childlike faith. Like Jesus talks about that, right? Like we should have a childlike faith. It's not that we're dealing with like a childlike faith oftentimes. I think a lot of times we're dealing with a childish faith. Where we take all of our longings and all of our hopes and we project them onto God, hoping that He'll get us through our latest crisis. And I think that God is open to doing that. I think that's because He's good. I think it's because He's kind. I think oftentimes He does step in. But oftentimes, like, He doesn't bail us out, and we're dealing with like the ramifications of the circumstances we're living in, and it's producing all of this doubt in us because we projected everything. And we've expected God to just step in and save us from like the consequences of our own decisions and actions and all of those sorts of things. When God does step in, when God is good and kind and faithful in those situations to rescue us from pain and difficulty, that's awesome and that's amazing. But listen to me, that's not the same thing as having a covenant relationship. It's not the same thing. Him just like rescuing you and rescuing me and like stepping in when we don't know what else to do, that's not the same thing as having like a covenant relationship or a life that is full of like deep and profound faith. And so sometimes when God doesn't do what we want, man, it can be extremely challenging. I mean, y'all know. I mean, our living proof. It can be very challenging. We find that our foundation, perhaps isn't as deep or as strong as it needs to be. And as a result, we can become very discouraged, and all sorts of doubts can then enter into our minds. I like what John Ortberg says. He says, scratch the surface of any cynic, and you'll find a wounded idealist underneath. You'll find a wounded idealist underneath. In other words, what he's saying here is that a wounded idealist is someone who has basically taken all of their stuff, they've projected it onto God, and when it doesn't go the way they need it to go, when it doesn't go the way they expected it to go, they become highly cynical, highly skeptical, and full of all kinds of doubt. And I think we should just acknowledge, right, that most of the time, like, it's our own personal circumstances that produce this doubt that we all feel. It's life not going according to our plan, life not working out the way we thought or expected it to go. And we're like, man, how can there be a good God when like this stuff clearly isn't good going on over here? And you know, on a kind of much more benign level, you know, there's just all of these thoughts and feelings we have when life doesn't go the way we thought. Like classic examples, like, man, thought I'd be married by now. Well, then there's all this ends up, you know, entering into our mind, like, man, is God really for me? Is God really with me? How come he's so good to others, but he's not necessarily good to me in this way? Thought someone would get well when I prayed for them, and they didn't. Thought my marriage would last, right? These are some of those classic thoughts and examples. And what happens is our very lives and expectations can often become shaken by doubt, and doubt enters into our minds, trickles down into our hearts, and eventually makes its way down deep into our spirit. We become very cynical, we become very skeptical, we become people kind of known for just sort of, you know, looking at things with like a suspicious eye. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't know that that's really something that I want to believe or something that could really happen. And all of it comes down to really our circumstances not going the way we expected. And look, this stuff is not easy, right? I'm not trying to patronize it, not trying to make it sound simple. It's super difficult. John Tyson says this. He says, faith focuses on what God is doing. Doubt focuses on what he isn't doing. And I think that's the best way to kind of understand the difference. It's the best way to understand kind of like the spectrum, right? Like the two ends of the spectrum of faith and doubt. One is focusing on all the things that God is doing, and one is focusing on all the things that he isn't. And I think that this is such a trap for people. It's such a trap for people on this kind of spiritual path, trying to figure out where they are with God. Like, there is so much good that God is doing. Like, there is so much that deserves airtime and deserves our attention and deserves our focus. And yet what can happen, the reason why doubt, I think, gets fed and the reason why it tends to grow is because we find ourselves so consumed with the things he hasn't done yet. And it causes us to really struggle, like, man, who is this God, and is he even good? Well, some of you know, this morning might be thinking, man, this isn't really me. You're not really talking to me. It's not an issue for you. You don't feel like you deal with doubt. Let me just say that must be nice. Like, it must be nice for you. Because as I read the Bible, you know, I notice doubt everywhere. It's like everywhere. People struggling. They're trying to figure this out. Even the great John the Baptist, did you know he had a very significant crisis with doubt? Did you know that about his story? Remember, John is raised with like this profound sense of calling on his life, right? Like, he knows as he's growing up that he is chosen by God, right? He's filled with the Holy Spirit in the womb. Like, I mean, he has grown up this way, knowing that there's like something special on his life, and yet after faithfully serving Jesus as a forerunner, literally preparing the way for the Messiah, for Jesus himself, what happens to John? He ends up in prison for what? Well, just for being obedient. And while John is in prison, somewhat surprisingly, I would say for him, maybe not for us, he starts to experience some real serious doubt. And I say surprisingly for him because John's like this radical, you know? He's kind of like, man, I'm just going to go like hang out like in the desert and like eat a bunch of locusts and wild honey and, you know, just like, I don't know, any scraps I can find to make clothing out of it. And I'm just going to like tell everybody about why they need to repent of their sin. So, I mean, he's a guy who's like not really easy to relate to. And yet we find him even in prison and struggling with some doubt. Some serious doubt, to the point that he sends some of his own disciples. You know, he had his own group of men who followed him around, and so from prison, he sends some of them to go find Jesus and ask Jesus a very, very pointed question. And the question is essentially this: are you really the one? Are you really the one? Listen to me. John knows that Jesus is the one. Like, John has baptized Jesus as the one. He has seen and famously declared in John 1:29, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Like this is John the Baptist. And so, listen to me, John knows theologically, he knows positionally that Jesus is The one, he knows these things theologically and positionally, but circumstantially. Circumstantially, he very much is wanting to know if Jesus is going to get him out of prison. And he's thinking something like, I get that you're the deliverer of Israel, but I want to know if you're ever going to deliver me. That's what's going on. And so you see Jesus gets this message, and he sends a short message back to John, through his disciples. And the message basically says this. It says, tell John that everyone else will be delivered except for him. All right, the blind will get their sight, he goes through the list, and the thing he leaves out of that famous prophetic passage that Jesus says in Luke 4, he leaves out that the captives will be set free. He leaves that out on purpose. It's a message to John saying you're not getting out. And so here's what happens to the story. John ends up dying shortly after this exchange by having his head cut off. It's pretty gruesome. He gets his head cut off because a young woman dances in a provocative way before the king, and out of his lust and perversion, he offers her anything that she wishes. So she goes and talks to her mom. What should I ask for? Well, her mom is so upset with John because her mom has been having a romantic, illicit relationship with her husband's brother, and John confronted them about it, and she doesn't like it, and so she's like, well, go ask the king to have John's head on a platter. We'd like that. That's awesome. That's not really man, I'm just being obedient. I'm just doing the things you told me to do, and this is what I get for that. And so how many of y'all know that John the Baptist is really experiencing what we would call a crisis of faith? Are you really the one? I thought you were the one, and I've given my life for this. Are you really the one or not? And yet, look, in spite of all of this, Jesus speaks of John in this way in Matthew 11:11. He says, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. That's pretty interesting. Jesus is saying, when you rank the prophets, John's at the top. There's nobody greater than him. Greater than Moses, right? He's going down. John is the greatest. That's what Jesus says. And so what we see in this story is John's story doesn't end the way he wants it to, and we see him wrestle with that, and I think this is what a lot of us wrestle with. I think it's perhaps why it's so common for doubt to enter into our hearts. And let me just say this, if you're on that journey, let me just say this, I think that we have to be willing to wrestle with the doubt that comes our way, not just accept it, not just be well, this is just a part of life, but wrestle with it, literally fight with it. Figure it out. What are you going to actually believe? So we get into Luke 24 today, and I know the time, but I got the mic a little late. So but look, guys, I got to give you a couple things before I let you out. So Luke 24, there is a story here where Jesus encounters his disciples after the resurrection, where he shows up into this room that they're hiding out in. And it says this, it says that while the disciples were still talking about this, meaning they're talking about the rumors that they have heard that Jesus has risen from the dead, but they have not seen him yet. So Mary has seen him in Luke 24. The two men on the road to Emmaus that we talked about last week, they have seen Jesus alive. The rumors are spreading, but they have not seen it for themselves. And so while they're still talking about this, in this room where they have been, they have sequestered themselves or hidden themselves from, Roman guards, Jesus himself stood among them. And he said, peace be with you. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. And Jesus said to them, why are you troubled? And look at this. And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. I love this. I love this interaction. Jesus very clearly, he says, why do doubts rise in your minds? The disciples in this encounter, they initially believe that they are seeing a ghost. as you would, right? Who expects this? They believe that this is a ghost. Their initial reaction is doubt. It's to doubt what they're seeing. They're rubbing their eyes. They're like, what? this is crazy. Like, am I really seeing what I think I am? And I think this is why I tend to be much more empathetic towards another disciple by the name of Thomas. The one whose enduring reputation over the last 2,000 years is for his doubt. Doubting Thomas. Because he's not here in this story. Like, he's the disciple who is absent. He's off doing something. I don't know what he's doing, but he's not here for this. He ends up going down with a reputation known for his doubt, unaffectionately known as Doubting Thomas. There's a classic painting called The Incredulity of St. Thomas, and whenever you see it, you can throw it on the screen. Whenever you see it, it's really like interesting to look at. It kind of pulls you into the well-known story here in John's gospel. And when you look at this painting, for me, like the first thing I noticed is like that Thomas is too old in this painting, right? I mean, he's just like, these are younger guys, like this, and perhaps his doubt has been so great that it's like quickly aged him. I'm not sure, like his anxiety or whatever it is, like it's aging him quickly. But you know what else like stands out to me when I look at this painting? Man, look at his forehead. Isn't that interesting? Look at the intensity on Thomas's face here. Like he's leaning in and he's struggling. Man, is all of this real? Thomas shows us something in his story that I don't think we can afford to miss, and that is this idea of wrestling with faith in the presence of doubt. Wrestling with faith in the presence of doubt. So his story is this in John chapter 20. It says, now Thomas, called Didymus. I love that. Like, man, which name should we go with? I'm all about Didymus. Like, not a lot of kids been named Didymus, Or, yeah. Yeah, T. Diddy. I mean, look at his story. I mean, that's just awesome. That's just awesome. It has no spiritual value. I just think it's awesome. Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples. Look at it. It says, all right, settle down. Okay. Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So this is what I just explained to you, at the previous encounter, Thomas wasn't there. And so in 25, the other disciples told him, hey, we've seen the Lord. But Thomas said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. A week later, Jesus' disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. But the doors were locked. Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Like, I don't know where you are necessarily at on your spiritual journey. Like, we all, like, I realize I'm speaking to an audience, like, where probably a lot of us have put our faith in Jesus, but you're not secluded from this, or excluded from this conversation this morning. A lot of us come to church with all sorts of thoughts and doubts. And I think that there is a word for you today that, like, it's actually, the Holy Spirit is on this. Like, if there was a reason why you came, it's to hear these words. Stop doubting and believe. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus told him, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. I think this passage is included in John's gospel for like a very strategic reason. I think it's included here because I think God wanted us to know what to do with our doubt. And in this story, like, the disciples tell Thomas basically about an experience that they had when Thomas isn't around, and it's not just your run-of-the-mill sort of thing, right? Hey, while you were gone, like this happened. No. This isn't like a small thing. This is sort of a big deal. They tell Thomas that while he's off somewhere else, Jesus, who was supposed to be dead, appeared to them. They tell Thomas that they have encountered the resurrected Jesus while he was off buying groceries or doing whatever. They tell Thomas that they have seen Jesus with their own eyes. But because Thomas hasn't experienced this himself, he has his doubts. In other words, like, this is just too big. This is too big. It's like too audacious of a claim to simply take their word for it. Thomas needs to see this himself. If he's going to believe what they're telling him, he needs to see it for himself. And man, I have such deep empathy for Thomas in this passage. Right? Like, because he historically has had a bad rap for his doubt, but I mean, look, like, he just has not experienced what everyone else has experienced, and as a result, he's just hesitant. He's a bit skeptical. He's not quick to believe the story that they're telling him, and he says it in verse 25, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. And here's what Thomas is saying, okay? Here's what he's saying. He's telling them that he very much believed in Jesus enough 3 years prior to drop everything in his life and follow Jesus. It's not that he hasn't believed previously. It's not that he hasn't had like great faith in the past. He's telling them, man, I've even had enough faith to believe, that and have no question that Jesus died. I saw that. But what he is saying here to the other disciples is this, and this is kind of my own paraphrase that I want to give you. He's basically saying, man, if you want to give me a story for which there is nothing to compare it to, and you want me to go all in, I'm going to need to see some proof. I'm going to need to see some proof. And yet Thomas, like, he knows how to go all in because he's previously gone all in. He's dropped everything and followed Jesus in the past. But in this story, he's acknowledging really that he has no grid for this. He has no grid for how to move forward simply based on what he has heard. He's going to need some evidence. This encounter that Thomas has with Jesus and with the disciples, it makes me think about a term sociologists have often used called spiritual bypassing. Maybe you've heard it before. If you grew up in like a strong, like sort of religious environment where like everything was just kind of put on God and you didn't have to deal with your junk. Spiritual bypassing is essentially where, you put your head in the clouds and you believe in God, and because of your belief in him, you don't have to worry about how you were raised as a child, or you don't have to worry about the abuse you experienced because God's just going to fix everything. And he's going to help you bypass any need to sort of confront what went on or to deal with it. It's just complete nonsense. But it's a term that's been used because there's been like great abuse at times in different parts of church experiences people have had where it's just like, hey, just believe God. Like, you're good. Like, you don't have to worry about all that stuff. You don't have to go deep and dig all that up and get healing for it. You can actually bypass it if you have God. And it's just not true. It's just not helpful in any way. You don't have to deal with like your family of origin stuff now that you've got God in your life. Like, that's a real thing, spiritual bypassing. Now apply spiritual bypassing to spiritual doubt. And I think this happens all the time where like you have like these real doubts about God and you just can't shake them. And like maybe the reaction to people at church or the reaction to people who follow God in your world, in your sphere of influence, they're like, man, that doesn't matter as long as you show up to church on Sunday. Just keep showing up. Like, you're going to be fine. Like, it's all gonna work out. And so we like there's this real thing like bypassing like some of our doubt or like not going straight through it and dealing with it and confronting it head on, but just kind of like going around it. And the problem with spiritual bypassing is that we don't operate out of what we wish. We operate out of what we are. And you can wish that you're healed and whole all you want, but you don't show up that way. The crises we've all experienced, they reveal what is on the inside of us, not what we wish was on the inside of us. You know what I'm saying? And so that's why I love what Eugene Peterson says. He says, the reason many of us do not ardently believe in the gospel is that we have never given it a rigorous testing, thrown our hard questions at it, faced it with our most prickly doubts. And I think this is a super hard process, and it can be a bit disorienting when you do it. And it can be dangerous. This is where if you've heard the term deconstructionism, this is where that kind of starts to happen, and can ultimately lead people to a place where they deconstructed and never reconstructed anything. Philippians 2:12. Paul writes this to the church in Philippi: continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You notice he doesn't say work for your salvation with fear and trembling. No, he says work it out. Work out your salvation with fear and with trembling. Like, listen to me, if faith is going to be real for you in your life, if it's going to be real, like if it's going to be deep, if it's going to be robust in your life, you're going to have to wrestle through it. And let me give you this thought. I would say that faith isn't the absence of doubt, as some people assume, but rather the means to push through it instead. Let me say it like this. There is no road to spiritual maturity that does not go straight through doubt. There's no road to spiritual maturity that bypasses your doubts. You have to go straight through them. Doubt is clearly a part of the human condition. Like, everybody doubts. There's not something inherently wrong with you if you doubt. I think it's part of life. In fact, did you know that atheists even doubt every single day? Did you know that? Everybody doubts. There's actually a really thought-provoking documentary that I've watched probably a handful of times, and I actually watched it again yesterday, and it's called Collision. You can watch it on YouTube. It's about an hour and a half long, and it looks at how 10 to 15 years ago there was this renewed push towards atheism in kind of the West. And there was a popular book called The God Delusion. Maybe some of you remember that coming out. And there was another one called God is Not Great. God is Not Great by the late famous atheist and spiritual debater Christopher Hitchens, if anybody remembers who he was. So this documentary on YouTube, it features Christopher Hitchens, who's somebody I've actually I've read a lot of his stuff and watched a lot of his debates. So in this documentary, that's what he's doing. Like, he's debating this pastor, Doug Wilson, and theologian and pastor. And if you've ever watched one of like Hitchens' debates, like, he's kind of this sort of like expensive Scotch kind of guy, with like that like long hair he has to like flip back, and then he's got all of this sort of arrogance and condescension, really. Like, he's got this humor too, and yet when you watch him, he even has, in spite of all of that, some level of like respect towards like traditional Bible-believing Christians, especially ones who would be, more fundamentalists, like those who actually really believe what the Bible says. Because what he found, even though he debated so many of them throughout his life, like, he could not deny their sincerity. Even though he clearly thought they were wrong. He passed away, 10 or more years ago. And at the end of this documentary, in the final scene, Hitchens and Wilson, they're in this car, they're riding in the back seat, and camera is on them. And Hitchens is basically asked if any of the Christian arguments that he's heard are worth his consideration. And so he replies by basically talking about the fine-tuning argument being like worthy of some level of consideration. And the fine-tuning argument is basically where if our planet was like 100 miles this way or 100 miles that way, life on Earth would not exist. And it sort of gives the appearance that life was strategically designed by a creator. And so Hitchens says, man, that's a tough one. Like, that's a real argument, like, I have to wrestle with. He actually says this in the documentary. He says, the fine-tuning argument doesn't prove Jesus, and it doesn't prove that there's a creator, but gee, there's something to it you have to wrestle with. Everybody doubts. And this is a beautiful scene of an atheist doubting his atheism. A true non-believer being tempted by faith. If it hasn't already happened to you, I believe that doubt will be a part of your story at some point. And the reason why that's a good thing is because of this. Look at this. Doubt is not the end of real faith. It's often the beginning. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. It is the invitation into a deeper faith. And you can fake it. You can fake it through your doubts if you want. You can try to pretend like they don't exist. But listen to me. There is no pep talk for the dark night of the soul. It doesn't exist. You have to wrestle with your doubts and see what it produces. The great Oswald Chambers says this in his book, My Utmost for His Highest, classic devotional. He says, doubt is not always a sign that a man is wrong. It may be a sign that he is thinking. I'm thinking. I'm not sure that what I've believed all these years is wrong, but I've just gone through some things, and I'm going to think about it for a second before I move forward. So doubt's a big deal, and I think the primary reason for why people doubt Jesus isn't because of how he lived. It's not even because of how he loved. The primary reason for why people doubt Jesus is because of what he claimed about himself. He claimed that he was God, right? That's a pretty big claim. Claimed that he was God, right? That if you want, a relationship with God, you got to go through him. Like he is the exclusive path, the exclusive way. When you make exclusive claims, people get very suspicious, right? Ortberg says this again. He says, faith is an exercise in strategic uncertainty. It's an exercise in strategic uncertainty. In other words, what he's saying here is that there's uncertainty in all of our lives, in lots of different areas. We're not completely certain. But he's saying, what he's saying here is that Christians are strategically saying this, that we should put our faith in the person of Jesus. And look, this thought right here, that we should put our faith in the person of Jesus, is the entire point of John's gospel, right? Not that you would just have good theology, not that you would read his gospel and have good doctrine, but that you would know the person of Jesus himself and find that he is worthy of your faith. Would you go ahead and come on up? In the 1800s, there was a man by the name of Charles Blondin who, I may have told you the story before, but he was a tightrope walker. And at 5 years old, his parents sent him to acrobat training school where he learned to walk the tightrope. By his early teens, he was a prodigy. He could walk a tightrope in crazy ways. At the age of 31, he moves to America where there's just way more opportunity for him to make money doing this, and he settles in and around the Niagara Falls area where he would perform most of his acts by walking across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. Crazy. One particular day, as he was doing this, there was 25,000 people that showed up to watch. Showed up to watch him traverse across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And so he starts off by simply just walking across. And as you can imagine, the crowd goes crazy. That's a pretty amazing thing to see. And so he gets to one side, and he decides he's going to go back, and he walks across again, but this time in sort of like a burlap sack. Then he did it again blindfolded. Then he did it on stilts. Listen to me, like the people are losing their minds. They're like, what is going on? And so the only problem with an act like this is that you have to keep thinking of new ways to make it bigger and better so that people remain interested, right? And so Blondin, he goes out there into the middle of this rope, right over the falls, and he takes what we would probably know or describe as like a hot plate and like a table and a chair, and he sits down and he makes himself an omelet right there over the middle of Niagara Falls, and people are just like, what? You're not a man, you're a god. They're crazy about this. And so next, Blondin, he decides, okay, we're going to do something else. He grabs a wheelbarrow, fills it with 200 pounds of rocks and cement, and he walks across this tightrope. It actually starts to as he's going, it starts to kind of, the rope goes down. You can see it struggling under the weight of this wheelbarrow. Gets to the other side, and he's about 20 feet from the end, and people are just cheering, wow, that's incredible. And so as he's standing there, he dumps the rocks and the cement off. He's not even to the other side yet. He's standing there looking at them, and he says, how many of you think I could carry a 200-pound man on my back across this tightrope? Crowd goes crazy. Of course you can. There's nothing you can't do. So Blondin asks, who's going to volunteer? Who's going to volunteer? Nobody volunteers. No, nobody volunteers. Why? Everybody believed he could do it, but no one wanted to be the person to take the risk. And listen to me, faith in Jesus is very much the same way. Look at this big thought as I'm getting ready to close. You see, the Gospel of John is not written for the purpose of creating fans who are impressed by everything Jesus ever did. It's written to show us how Jesus came to take us from death to life, from one side of the canyon to the other, from one side of the falls to the other. The question we all face is whether we're willing to climb on his back and let him carry us or not, because you can't get to the other side on your own. You can't. Listen to me, you can't just believe that Jesus did all these amazing things. He's looking for you to take another step. And man, this is very, very, very difficult for someone like me to preach in the Midwest, where so many people identify as Christians and might even say that they're a believer. And I just want to tell you that belief is not enough. It's not enough. What he is looking for is your faith. Your faith. And the only way you ever arrive at enduring faith, let me tell you, is by confronting the doubt that wants to derail you. So that you come to know a faith that pleases God. So the story goes like this. John 20:28, Thomas says to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." And what you see in this statement is doubt turned to faith. Doubt turns to faith. Let me just say this, your future does not have to be one of doubt. It can be one of great faith, because look, faith does not depend on the strength of your belief, but on the mercy and grace of God. Sometimes we think that our faith is our faith is strong as long as we feel like it's strong. You ever just had days where your faith doesn't feel quite as strong, and you're like, I don't know what's going on with me. And we think that our faith is strong. We have a lot of faith as long as we feel like it's strong. Listen to me, that's a false perspective. Your faith is not strong because you feel strong. Your faith is strong because Jesus is holding you. That's a significant difference. God's grace is sufficient for you if you have trusted in him, whether you feel strong in your faith or not. The question is not how you feel, but whether or not you are in the wheelbarrow. It's not about how you feel. It's about where you are. And man, can you imagine being in the wheelbarrow? I mean, that's what faith is like. There's times where you just want to throw up. You're like, what am I doing, Are we really going to get there? The question is not how you feel. It's about whether or not you're in the wheelbarrow. Listen to me. Look at this. Our confidence has to be in the finished work of Jesus on the cross and not in our own sense of self-assurance. I think I'm good. I think I feel all right. Gotta reassure ourselves, that's not what it is. It's the finished work of Jesus. Put your confidence in that, not in you, not in how you feel. So I'm closing with this. Back to Thomas, the doubter. It's almost unfair because this is only one scene from his life. It's not his destiny, right? This isn't like the rest of his story. It's one scene. You know what happens to Thomas after this? You know what happens? According to church tradition, Thomas is one of the apostles who actually hears Jesus just a few verses later, right here, and he goes into all the world, preaches the gospel, specifically to India. Thomas becomes the first and only apostle to go outside of the Roman Empire, to take the message of Jesus outside of the Roman Empire. Thomas brings the kingdom of God to a part of India, makes a huge impact, but to a part of India where to this day, in these same parts of India, the name Thomas is actually a common name for an Eastern Indian man, whether it's a first name or a last name. You would not expect that to be a name over there, would you? That's 2,000-year-old legacy. In fact, his faith in Jesus becomes so strong that he endures all the way to the end of his life, where he would eventually be martyred, killed by a spear being thrust through his heart in a cave in India. Listen to me. Thomas doubted for sure, but he was not a doubter. He doubted, but he was not a doubter. He was faithful. He was a missionary. He was a believer. He was an apostle. He was a martyr. He was a man who overcame his doubt and left an incredible impact on the planet because his destiny wasn't doubt, his destiny was faith. And I want you to hear like a huge thought as I close today. Look, don't let a chapter of your life define the rest of your life. Listen, don't let a chapter of your life define the rest of your life. You got to catch that. Thomas could have easily been there. He could have easily been like, man, like, I don't know. Like this is all I can ever be. This is all I can ever become. Listen to me. Your destiny is not doubt and failure. Your destiny is the faithfulness of God that is on your life. Would you just stand with me for a moment as we close in prayer? Invite our prayer team to come forward. We have a prayer team that's well-trained to be able to pray with any of you who just need some ministry today. If you just need some prayer, something just in the message that's been challenging you, you just want to pray about it, or maybe there's a physical issue in your body, or you need encouragement. You just need to come closer to God, need a touch from God. And encourage you here in a moment to just come up for some prayer. If there's maybe a physical reason why that's difficult for you to do, to come forward. If you just stay where you're seated as we dismiss and raise your hand, the prayer team will come to you and pray with you there. But I want you to think about this thought. Thomas had enough belief to die for Jesus. Do you have enough belief to live for Jesus? Right? Would you just bow your heads and close your eyes for a moment? If you just say, hey, Pastor Jordan, there's some things today, man, I just can't shake it. I can't avoid it. I can't pretend like I didn't hear it. And I've been wrestling through some doubt. And I just need some prayer today. I need some prayer because I think it's time for me to just surrender. It's time for me to just, climb into that wheelbarrow. It's time for me to kind of leave all of that doubt, and let it propel me into great faith. Can I just see your hand today and pray for you, encourage you? Like, it's time to wrestle with some things. It's time to push through some doubt. It's time to wrestle with it. It's time to trust Jesus for who he really is. And so, Father, I just thank you in this house this morning that you are good and that you are faithful and that you are present and that you are here. Holy Spirit, I just ask that you would come now and you would begin to just confront every single one of us, just as you do in such an amazing, beautiful, kind way. And I ask, Father, that you would just, lift our head. Similar to Thomas, would you just kind of hold out your hands and say, look, it's really me. I really am who I said I was. God, I ask that in this room right now, that there would just be such a gift of faith that would settle in this house. Pray that faith would rise inside of every person today under the sound of my voice. Any kind of doubt that just has been like an assignment from the devil to keep us from really living how we should. I just pray, God, for ears to hear right now. Ears to hear the truth, eyes to see. And Lord, I pray today that we would walk out of here knowing that we have dealt with some things. There's some things perhaps we have struggled with that we've left here today. We're not going to take it with us. And I pray, Father, that there would be some people in this house right now this morning that as they walk out those doors, they will have left behind all of that great doubt that they've been struggling for such a long time, and that they would walk out with great faith. I pray for just a spiritual transaction to take place today where doubt would be left at the altar, God. Doubt would be left in this room, and faith would be the gift that we get to take with us all the way home. Father, would you just encourage every person here today under the sound of my voice? God, I thank you that there's nothing just inherently wrong and evil in us, because we struggle through some things about faith and Christianity and you, Jesus. But Lord, I pray today that you would just begin to speak to every heart, every spirit, God. Just help us to see and to know and to understand who you are and your great love for us. And I pray for courage in here to take that next step, to push through and wrestle through doubt, whatever it takes. In Jesus' name, amen.